Good evening and welcome to the Free Press live stream. I'm Will Ron. Thank you for being here. Tonight, the American right is in a moment of profound chaos and dysfunction. Many conservatives are alarmed by the anti-Semitic rhetoric coming from Gen Z commentator Nick Fuentes and his nihilistic Groyper movement. At the same time, Candace Owens is floating conspiracy theories suggesting Israeli involvement in the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And Tucker Carlson, perhaps the most influential right-wing broadcaster, has taken a dark and conspiratorial turn. And now Marjorie Taylor Greene has broken publicly with the president over the Epstein files, attacking him on Twitter and across cable news. There is infighting, division, mudslinging, and a general sense of disorientation. To help us make sense of all this, I'm joined tonight by a wonderful guest, journalist and historian Sam Tanenhaus. His work traces the origins and evolution of the modern conservative movement, including the recent excellent biography of William F. Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. Sam, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, great to be with you, Will. Looking forward to it. Strange times.
Yes, very strange times. And I want to remind everybody, if you have a question for either me or Sam or the both of us, please put it in the chat box. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. Sam, I want to start with your broad thoughts on the uproar on the right that has broken out since Charlie Kirk's murder. Tucker and Candace on one side, Ben Shapiro on the other, Megyn Kelly and J.D. Vance somewhere in the middle, depending on the day. These fights had obviously been bubbling up for some time, but what do you make of it?
I'm sorry, one place we begin, Will, is I think we're all getting that the Trump era is coming to a close.
Yeah.
And there's a competition, also kind of soul searching to see what goes next, what comes next. And it's partly because although there are aspects of MAGA and the conservative movement of the moment that echo and reflect what we've seen and heard before, what's different is so much in the past decade has been the result of Trump's own conquest of both the Republican Party and the movement, that it's hard to know what it looks like without him. And so now what we're beginning to see are these different strains of MAGA and of the right as it exists today. You know, I was on Steve Bannon's show the other day, and he calls it the populist movement. And I keep picking up that term more and more now from some on the right. They're already shifting into something different. And I think what we're witnessing is the emergence of these competitive voices. And I'd add to that how many of them are outside of elective politics.
Yes.
As Trump himself was. We're not talking about the Republican Party at odds the way it has been. You know, I've been writing, as you know, for a long time about the rise of the right and the conservative movement and its intersection of great figures, you know, intellectuals like Buckley or before him Whitaker Chambers, these people I've written about, and how their ideology and worldview fitted itself into the more traditional Republican Party. Well, that Republican Party feels so empty or hollow or faceless or soulless at this point that it's these outside figures seem to dominate it more than the elected ones do.
Yeah, I think your point exactly about we have some political figures in here, but we're talking about a lot of people who are essentially in show business. They have podcasts, they have live streams, they have their own internet shows. And I was thinking a little bit, I'm not sure if you saw it, but the quote from the creators of South Park, who have been doing all of this wild anti-Trump stuff on their show. And they did an interview about it, and they said, it's not that we became political, it's that politics became pop culture. And I'm just wondering what you make of this time where it's the politicians seem secondary at this point to internet voices.
Yeah, I remember years ago writing a piece for the New Yorker that David Remnick asked me to do when I was at the New York Times, a review of Sarah Palin's book, Going Rogue. Do you remember that?
Oh, I do.
Yeah. And I remember one of the points that was circulating then, one of the arguments being made was that Fox News seemed to be the auxiliary of the Republican Party. And I remember writing in that piece, no, it's the opposite. The Republican Party has become kind of the outer edge of Fox News, because Fox News was really sort of dominating. Now, far more media at this point, far more, as a Bill Buckley word, atomized media, with different people operating in different fronts and with their own constituencies. What's interesting to me about Tucker Carlson, who was in his own way a Buckley follower, as so many people on the right are, and Tucker Carlson's son is named Buckley, that
I don't think that's after William F.
No, it's not. One of those interesting kind of what do we call it?
Nominative destiny or something.
Yes. And so you have Tucker Carlson bringing Nick Fuentes under his program. Set aside the ideology, you hate it or love it or think it's cracked or whatever. Just in tactical, strategic terms, he's saying this is a guy who's got a significant following, and he wants to either incorporate it, annex it, or make some kind of alliance with it. And when you're in the world of media, as you say, these people kind of playing politics in a media landscape, that's what we're going to see. So in the old days, it might be, well, how do we bring this group of libertarians onto our side, in the crucial bill we're fighting for, or when we're writing a party platform. Now it's a matter of audiences and views and clicks and clickbait, and that changes the tenor of the argument. I'm not sure that at bottom, the arguments are really all that different. It's just that we're living in a moment, and Buckley anticipated this, where rhetoric has become dominant. It's the things you say and the way you say them are how we define ourselves politically. And so it's going to be these clever, articulate, very plausible sounding voices who are going to dominate a lot of the discussion.
I think a little bit, though, about the Groypers and Nick Fuentes and the idea of bringing them aboard some sort of coalition that you then want to be an electable coalition, at least in theory. And these would seem to be people who are going to turn off the vast majority of voters. Yes, he has a niche. Yes, he has a following. Apparently, that following is rather substantial among young Republicans in Washington, D.C. right now, according to Rod Dreher's piece and some other anecdotes we've seen flying around. But Buckley dealt with this. He had to dance around the lunatic fringes of the right of his time, the John Birch Society, General Edwin Walker, who's largely forgotten to history, but was a Looney Tunes segregationist and a violent, bloody-minded fellow who Robert F. Kennedy put in an institution. And Buckley, correct me if I'm wrong here, but he really seemed to have sort of a genius to know it's like when to bring them in and when to push them out, like where the fault line was and when's the moment to strike and say, it's like, no, this is unacceptable. You're not going to be part of this organized movement. And there's nobody like that today. It doesn't seem. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think the way you put it, Will, is really important because Buckley did it really strategically. One of the interesting things for me observing how Buckley is now being invoked and brought into the conversation is that the picture we're getting of him is a simpler one that you've just described. It's that Buckley was a gatekeeper and he announced when someone or some movement or faction had gone too far, and then he excommunicated them. Well, politics didn't work that way then, and it doesn't work that way now. What Buckley did was strategically, in concert with others, to arrive at a place where they thought they could make a public statement or where they could shift the narrative and discussion. I'll give you a really good example of that I think you may have in mind. It has to do with the rise of two groups, the John Birch Society in particular.
Which believed, among other things, that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent and that fluoride was poisoning us all.
Well, see, here's the interesting thing there. The founder, as he called himself, was a businessman in Massachusetts, made those assertions and published them in books.
You broke up for a second. We're talking about Robert Welch here.
Robert Welch, yes. Who was in some ways a kind of rival of Buckley. Buckley had been very friendly with Welch in the 1950s. when the John Birch Society was founded in 1958, 59, that's kind of borderline there, Buckley supported it. He thought it was fine. So these are the grassroots, right? The door knockers, the clipboard carriers, the phone callers who are going to get the conservatives out on primary day to get the right candidate elected. And yes, they're going to be a little kooky. I was just looking at a comment Buckley wrote in 1957. He says, let's face it, our side, the right, has more crackpots than the other side does. And so you have to accept that, well, what do you do with the kooks? And there was an internal debate, but it reached a kind of pressure point when Robert Welch himself, the founder of the John Birch Society, became a public figure. Before that, he hadn't been. He'd been a very adroit and adept organizer behind the scenes. He was able to get groups of people together who signed onto his platform, and the platform was basically militant, unrelenting anti-communism. And Welch, in his own mind, was a conspiracist. And he cooked up this theory, as you said, that the second leading communist in America, communist agent, was Dwight Eisenhower, controlled by his brother Milton Eisenhower, the president of Johns Hopkins University. I mean, wacky stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, Buckley knew that was out there. He'd read Welch's manuscript. But as long as that didn't reach the public, it didn't really matter. When it mattered was when the mainstream media began looking at Welch and reporting on all of this. So Buckley's a key line that I saw when I was going through his material. He's explaining to somebody why he had decided early 1960s to excommunicate Welch, right? Excommunicate Buckley the Catholic. That's the verb he's going to use.
Yes,
and what he said, and what he says is, if the general public thinks the leadership of our movement is in the hands of crazy people, we'll never win them over. In other words, it doesn't matter what somebody guy on the street thinks, but if the people on top are seen as extremists or weird, we're going to lose the middle that we need. Buckley's saying that in part, Will, because he is trying to make his way in a media landscape totally dominated by liberals. The major newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, there wasn't even a Wall Street op-ed page, Wall Street Journal editorial page like we know. Time Magazine, Newsweek, all the major publications, except for Buckley's own National Review, were in the opinion of Buckley and company, leftist. We would call them mainstream liberal. They would call them leftist. Maybe it's come around now. We call them all left wing today. So in other words, Buckley was so outnumbered that he knew if he and his cohort were not taken seriously by liberals, by liberal intellectuals in the media, that they couldn't get any purchase. That media is gone now. Buckley helped create the alternative media. So they proceed with much less fear of what the outside world thinks. And so I'll add one thing to that, which is interesting. So the big event that Buckley did, everyone remembers, and I describe it, of course, in my book, how he wrote a blistering essay, editorial in National Review, pointing out the absurdities of Robert Welch's arguments, that no, it wasn't the CIA that had installed Fidel Castro in power, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the event that really made a difference was when one of his colleagues, a guy named Marvin Liebman, who was a brilliant organizer and stager of events, organized a big celebration for Barry Goldwater, who's the man they want to be nominated in 1964. So 2 years ahead of that time, Liebman organizes a rally, Madison Square Garden, the old garden, not the one we have today, still holds 20,000 people, and invites the leading lights in the conservative movement, but excludes Edwin Walker, the crazy general in Texas, excludes Robert Welch, excludes all the Birchers. And what happens? He gets the big front and center story on page 1 of the New York Times the next day, which is how you measured media success in that era. The Times writes a glowing article about how Buckley's own organization, Young Americans for Freedom, rather than the Birchers, are now the dominant organization within the right. And they are are making the movement younger and hipper and more intellectual and should be taken more seriously. And the Times follows that with a four-part series on radicalism and American campuses across America. And Buckley is controlling the narrative once again. The Birchers were still there. In fact, their numbers grew, but the conversation shifted. And that's what feels more complicated today, because there's not just one conversation. You and I are having this one.
Yeah.
And Roger Kimball and some guys at Heritage are having a second one. And there are other conversations you and I don't even want to know about that are being held in other places.
I think that's correct. And God knows the conversations that are happening at Heritage right now between the various warring factions that seem to have engulfed that think tank since Kevin Roberts decided to defend Tucker Carlson. But I want to go back to a moment. We were talking about Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater was the great hero and champion of the right, senator from Arizona. His father was Jewish. I believe he's the only presidential candidate is half Jewish. I know John Kerry had some Jewish ancestry, but Goldwater used to joke that only his mother's side could join a country club. And this was the man that the right then, what the New York Times may have viewed as sort of the radical right, was rallying around. Now we have this moment where right-wing anti-Semitism, which seemed for a long time to be quite dormant or at least relegated to the fringes, is now entering the conversation in a big way, particularly since Tucker Carlson brought Nick Fuentes on his show. And Nick Fuentes is talking about starting think tanks. He has the allegiance, apparently, of people who are working in congressional offices. I've heard stories of, him being played in the background, even in the executive branch in the White House. And I'm wondering, what do you make of this sudden emergence of this really virulent anti-Semitism on the right?
Well, of course, as we know, it's been around for a long time. And in
Sure.
fact, even when Goldwater made that famous appearance at the Garden, he made a previous one in New York the year before, there was a contingent on the far right that was making the same charge that about the Jew Goldwater. And it was much more easily contained back then, partly because they had fewer channels, fewer outlets for expressing those opinions. And there was more of an organized mainstream media that was not going to allow those voices to be heard. And the conservative media that Buckley dominated in some ways mirrored the mainstream media. Great historian of conservatism, the Republican Party guy named Jeff Cabaservice told me, I was writing a story, I think, for Esquire magazine. And Jeff was also the main first researcher on the Buckley book. He was a grad student then. He said, Buckley's idea of an alternative media was his own version of the New York Times. Mm-hmm. In other words, one that would be as sophisticated and as well-researched, as well-reported, as taken as seriously. It's that kind of seriousness that seems gone now. That feels generational to me. And I know a number of people are saying within the movement, this is the old guard against the new guard. And it's the new guard that has taken up more of these memes and tropes that come out of that murkier side of the movement. And I'm reminded, I'm sure you're well aware of it too, that in the first days of Trumpism, there was talk about that, the alt-right and Richard Spencer and these others who were either flirting with or openly embracing anti-Semitism and real extremism, and that seemed to go away.
Yeah.
Right. Then you have the Freudian return of the repressed, and it's back here again. And that will be something for a future historian to look at, is where all those passions went. The only analogy I can think of to that, now we're going to go back even to an earlier period in the conservative movement, is the first movement Buckley belonged to as a teenager, the America First movement, post entry in World War II, as you know.
Charles Lindbergh, yes.
Led by Lindbergh, who was Buckley's first political idol, was Charles Lindbergh. And after Pearl Harbor, that movement seemed to dissipate. but it never really did. And one of the best chroniclers of that politics, because he himself belonged to a fascinating figure named Murray Rothbard. You probably know about John Gans. Our friend John Gans loves Murray Rothbard. I get a big kick out of Murray Rothbard too. He's a very interesting figure. Jewish, by the way, of course. And he said, no, they didn't go away. They formed little enclaves. They were always there, sharpening and refining their arguments. One way to think about it is, I'm guessing that when people heard Fuentes for the first time, they were surprised at how glib and well-spoken he was, because you have an idea going into it that he's not going to be able to complete a coherent sentence because of what you'd heard before. Then he turns out to be remarkably poised and plausible in the way he presents himself. And that's going to throw a lot of people off. That's why writers like John Gans and others are saying you have to listen really closely. You have to pick up these undercurrents because they're not going to be clear to so many people. And that, Will, brings us around to the first question you began with, which is so important. What about the great middle in America?
Yes.
These are not extremists. They're not lunatics. They're not bigots. They're not racists. And yet they seem to be willing to entertain alternatives in politics that we would not have thought plausible or attractive, say, 15 years ago, 20 years ago? And that's the Trump effect, I think, where those boundaries have really been broken, and it opened up the room for these people to get in.
Well, at the same time, Donald Trump, his daughter is Jewish. Stephen Miller is Jewish. I mean, he has a lot of, he does not appear to be an anti-Semite or somebody who has much tolerance for anti-Semitism. And it strikes me that if anybody could be a gatekeeper today, it's probably Donald Trump. But he seems to have entered a period of lame duckitis, which, for whatever reason, seems to forbid him or prevent him from stopping these conversations or just trying to keep the ranks in line. I mean, you see the right, his own coalition, MAGA, the traditional conservatives, the traditional Republicans, they're all falling apart. They're at war with each other. And he's talking about, we're going to have 50-year mortgages. He just seems checked out or clued out or just not interested in weighing in this conversation. J.D. Vance, of course, has more skin in the game because he is going to run for president in 2028. He is the heir apparent to the MAGA movement. But J.D. Vance, I'm not sure, knows how to deal with this either. But it would seem like stern denunciations of anti-Semitism coming from the leaders of the Republican Party could carry some weight, and they've done a little bit of that. But I'm wondering if there's anyone you see as a potential gatekeeper, somebody who could essentially go to the Fuentes people and say, you're out. This isn't going to work. You're not part of our coalition. You're a bunch of freaks. We don't like you. Is there anyone on the landscape that you see who could do that?
No. And here's the difficulty. I don't think there was ever anyone who could. Buckley never went to the Birchers as an organization and said you should dissolve. He came around to saying something close to that several years later, after he'd run for mayor in 1965, and they had their new political leader, Ronald Reagan, his disciple in California. Yeah. Reagan's gubernatorial campaign came pretty directly out of Buckley's mayoral campaign in New York. And there's an important thing, too. Buckley was able to establish legitimacy for his movement in part by being a brilliant candidate for office himself. He ran a campaign in some ways parallel to Mamdani's, the outsider who's brilliant at media, who had a charismatic personality, great talker, great speech maker. And he was able to shift the conversation in that way. But Buckley and those around him were very careful about antagonizing the base. A good example of that, Will, is the career of Richard Nixon. Because Nixon came out of California politics and he understood sort of the emotional attitudes of what was then called middle American, angry Americans, right? Radical centrists, whatever the names were.
The silent majority.
Yes, silent majority, is as his speechwriter, Patrick Buchanan, came to call them. Well, but Nixon was distrusted by the hardcore in the Republican Party because he had been vice president to the very centrist Dwight Eisenhower. So Nixon was always looking to protect his right flank. And he, in California, almost ended his political career when he ran for governor and antagonized the hard right, the John Birchers, by denouncing them. And the incumbent,
Pat Brown,
put Nixon into a corner where he kind of challenged him to denounce them. And Nixon regretted it for the rest of his life. And he told Buckley that he learned, Barry Goldwater had taught him that you can't win only with the right, but you also can't win without the right. His loss had taught him you have to have the right as well. So J.D. Vance, who seems to me a very strategic person in all of this, is looking at that same two-step you have to make. He has to shore up his credentials with the movement, with the base, and then he has the intellectual confidence, I think. I read Vance a little differently from others. I see him as more confident and strategic than a lot of other people do. Maybe it's because a friend of mine, Mike Lind, who I think is a really brilliant political writer, really swears by Vance. He says, this is something Mike told me, said he thinks Vance is the most serious intellectual in American politics. I'm glad you put down your Coke can here. Since Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great senator from New York.
That's high praise.
That's about the high, right? We know if you're a geek and follow this stuff, it doesn't get higher than that. I think Vance sees everything and understands everything, whether he has the political charisma to pull it off. And that leads me to something you said about Donald Trump. I absolutely agree with everything you said about Trump. Not only that he's by no means anti-Semitic, I think all the bigotry and racism imputed to him misfires. Just look at the results he gets with minority voters. They're seeing something that white Democrats, white liberals maybe don't, which is a kind of authenticity. Well, Trump, we also know, doesn't have a great deal of patience for ideology, for intellectual arguments. And so if he has no skin in that game, he's not going to pay much attention. And as you say now, we've reached this lame duck phase. We're seeing who is circling next, who can make it work. And maybe Trump's last kind of great show of power, kind of reached the King Lear phase, is to decide whom he anoints.
Yeah.
And that he can stretch out a long time, right? As long as he commands the support of the base.
Assuming he anoints J.D. Vance, his very loyal vice president, somebody who's been trying to get that imprimatur for a long time, can J.D. Vance, looking forward to 2028, and I don't want to get too bogged down in electoral politics here, but in terms of the camp, the coalition that Vance is building or trying to build, do you see the Groypers as having a seat at that table?
He seems to think they do. John Gans, our friend John Gans, has said he thinks he's already Groypered, I think was his verb. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. At this point, I think Vance is following the playbook. First, no enemies to the right, but also a key aspect to the Buckley argument, which goes back a long way, is in the nerdish term, the too quokey or look who's talking argument, right? In other words, every time they come after your worst guy, find the worst guy on the other side and go after them. So Buckley's second book, he wrote a number of bestsellers. The first was The Famous God and Man at Yale, which set the table for the cultural politics of our time. The second book was called McCarthy and His Enemies.
Yes.
And if you read that book, you'll see a lot less on McCarthy than you will on his enemies.
Yes.
Who are the enemies? The media, the liberals, the intellectual elite. If you can build up enough opposition to them, in a sense, build them up as still the more powerful force, then you can organize opposition to it. part of the problem, as we're discussing here, is this isn't a world dominated by liberals any longer. Yeah, they're out there, the progressives out there, but they're outnumbered at many fronts. And so it's hard to stir maybe a flyover country voter into thinking, well, the real problem is, all those Jews you have in the English department at Harvard University. It's only going to get you so far. So I think J.D. Vance is calculating that very closely. And I wonder about, to me, the most mysterious figure in all of this is his quite brilliant wife, who seems very pragmatic and obviously first-rate intelligence, ambition, gifts. And where does she figure into all of this, particularly when she's being, denounced and, demonized in disturbing terms?
Right, by Nick Fuentes.
By Nick Fuentes.
Yeah, using racist, because she's the daughter of Indian immigrants, and he's using racist terms to describe her and attack J.D. Vance in the process. Does J.D. Vance, I just don't even understand. What's a parallel of somebody like of Vance's stature as vice president groveling to the far right?
What a great question. Because when we look at someone like Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush,
we
weren't saying that. Nope. Now, he did bring in very, brass knuckle style campaign guys like Lee Atwater to beat up in the opposition and to traffic in that era in racial stereotypes. Candidates are never really afraid to do that. They'll do it in both parties. Remember, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were going after Barack Obama in a similar way. Saying there's a guy can't win, who's going to vote for a black guy. So those things are always in the fringes of our politics. I'll tell you in part what it comes down to is the cultural moment we're in. Are we in a cultural moment where extremism and a kind of radicalism of emotion and spirit are so widespread that there really is almost nothing off limits, and you're measured, you're assessed by what seems to be your candor, your emotional candor? And something I've thought about with President Trump for a long time is no one may have accumulated a longer record of falsehoods, but no one matches him in these certain areas of speaking with a kind of emotional directness. And I think that's what Vance needs to improve most. He doesn't have the authenticity. Maybe it's because he intellectualizes it too much. He's thought through the position so much. You mentioned Rod Dreher before. To me, he's someone who's trying to run a kind of interference for Vance. But again, that's on a much higher level. That's on the level of argumentation, as some of the other post-liberal intellectuals are doing. But reaching the base, touching them, that's an extraordinary gift that very few politicians have. Have you seen anyone else? I'm curious. Have you seen anyone left or right who has it in the way that an Obama or Trump has it?
Well, I think Zoran Mamdani, to some extent, I think his appeal is limited outside of certain metropolitan areas. Obviously, he can't ever run for president because he was born in Uganda. Also, as we know, the mayor of New York City never goes on to do really anything after that because it's just the last job you ever have. Nobody wants you around anymore. Even Rudy Giuliani, the most popular man in America after 9/11, he couldn't make it work. But I think Zoran Mamdani tapped into something, the youth wing of the left, the youth wing of the Democratic Party. He was able to really read that and speak to that because he comes directly from it. So I would say he's an example. And talking about the Buckley style of argumentation of saying, Joe McCarthy, it's like, okay, yes, Joe McCarthy said some things that were incorrect, but what about all of these people who are criticizing him? They are awful, awful people. They're in line with communists to some extent. Mamdani, I think, is going to be a figure that's going to be brought up a lot by the Republican Party moving forward, moving into the midterms, moving into the general election. Right now, on the right, I'm not sure I see somebody who's completely plugged into the grassroots because nobody knows what the grassroots are. I think we're still trying to figure that out. How big is this Groyper movement? How much of this is, the old conspiratorial stuff about chemtrails, which Tucker has been on lately? And how many just normie Republicans are left? Just people who are basically, they just want their taxes to be a little bit lower. They want, they're patriotic. They have their flag outside. They like Israel. They want to be involved in the international scene. That group of people, that camp, how big that camp is. I think we're having a lot of trouble just measuring the size of these various camps on the right.
Yes, I think that's why you mentioned before how Rod Dreher caused a small sensation when he said he was told what he learned is that 30 to 40% of the new establishment, Republican establishment in Washington, the young people are Groypers. And I think that's what Vance is looking at. If you see it in generational terms, it's hard for normal people. Well, let's say you and I are normal, and the people, and most of those who are listening to us right now are pretty normal. We don't understand as easily how someone could speak with that rhetorical extremism, the fanaticism that we associate with some of the worst events in human history, and see it as a kind of amusing way to tweak your opponent, to go after them. We don't get it. That feels generational to me. I think J.D. Vance is locked into that. It goes back to that group of tweets and text exchanges that came out of remember the Republican group?
The young Republicans, yes.
The young Republicans. And he said, well, boys will be boys, even if they're 35-year-old boys, they will be boys. But he was picking up on this idea that there's a different language and rhetoric out there. One of Buckley's great observations, he was writing about Governor Reagan. The Governor Reagan in his first term, when the right was disappointed that he wasn't more aggressively anti-government than they thought he would be. And Buckley said, he said, you have to give him time. Rhetoric precedes action. And so he said, rhetoric is the important thing. If somebody's saying the right thing, then eventually they'll do the right thing. Well, you can say it in reverse. If they're saying the wrong thing, then maybe they'll do the wrong thing. That's what we're frightened about now, that it's not just talk, that somebody who goes on his podcast or goes on YouTube and says outrageous things but has no power, we can laugh him off until he does get power. And this seems to have been one of the lessons some have drawn from the Trump years. But again, we are in this place where the clear standards, the rules, the boundaries feel unfamiliar, because it may be that they're being reestablished or redrawn in some way that we don't really know about. I want to add one thing to that. You mentioned Mamdani. I agree about that. It was interesting to me that Steve Bannon, who was a very shrewd observer of politics, right away said to Politico, this is a generational talent. Remember he said that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but he wasn't saying he should be deported because that's the trolling thing. He also says, be wary. This guy knows what he's doing and can gather a lot of people behind him. And that's someone aware, I think, Will, of exactly what you're saying, which that a youth-driven politics, who really connects with young people. Remember the excitement or concern after Trump's victory in November was that he had mobilized these young male voters no one knew really could be mobilized or grouped together in any significant way. Well, what if Mamdani's doing that on the other side, which leads to the next thing. We're living in a kind of horseshoe moment as well. We hear that term all the time, horseshoe politics, right and left bend, right? The center goes away.
Fringes get together at some point.
That's it. The extremes meet. Well, if there is a place where that is happening, it's Gaza. And so Fuentes on Gaza does not sound all that different from someone on the left on Gaza. And if that's the case, if right and left are realigning in this way, then you get a different sounding politics. One of the interesting things to me, again, to go back in history, when we talk about Barry Goldwater, is who liked Goldwater at the time he was being denounced by the liberal establishment, a term National Review coined in the 50s. His fans included Joan Didion, Gary Wills, liberal intellectuals, great writers, liked his authenticity. They liked his Western kind of nonchalance and bluntness of manner. He didn't seem like a professional politician. Well, we know a lot of Trump's success derives from that too, from coming to seem from outside. He doesn't seem fixed in the mold that the parties would push on us. I'm struck by Marjorie Taylor Greene now, by the way. She's presenting herself as someone who's standing outside the institutional oppressions of government. And I think whoever comes out of the right now is going to have to be able to at least talk an effective game that way, to reach those legions of voters. Did you see the number of Trump voters who went from Mamdani? Did you see that?
No, but I imagine it's huge.
Well, it was 60,000, which
Yeah.
isn't enormous.
In a city of 8 million, yeah. But it's still, that's a lot of human beings casting votes for very different candidates. Though candidates have some similarities too, at least.
Yes, well, and 2 million people vote. We're talking about 3%. 3% can change an election.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of free floating, kind of unknowable, a lot of variables in our politics now because of the thing you said at the very beginning, which is that politics has become almost a subset of our pop culture.
It's a subset of media. It's a subset of show business to some extent. I used to think, but people always described like politicians and politics as a freak show. And I'd walk around Congress as a young reporter, and I was like, these people don't seem too freaky. The media seems freaky. I came up in conservative journalism a little bit. My first job was at the Daily Caller, working for Tucker. And that was fun, but, weird people were coming in and out. I guess I got a little bit of a preview of the right to come. But so much of this is now just, to my mind, just pure show business. But at the same time, tapping into Gen Z, getting that youth anger, tapping into it, speaking to it authentically, speaking to it with empathy, speaking to it with understanding. I think that's essential. While at the same time, if you have somebody like Nick Fuentes at the table who's talking about organized Jewry, taking over the country, this kind of very old style anti-Semitism in a sense, also driven by anger over the war in Gaza. I just don't think that's a vote winner. I feel like if I'm a Republican politician, if I'm JD Vance, I'm like, these guys, I cannot win with these guys.
I would agree. And the only case to try to make then is the enemy's case. The other guys are worse. The Tukwoki argument. And I think there are limits to it. And again, it's not going to work. I think you're right when you're talking about the general broad base of voters. I'm reminded of an interview that Barack Obama did with great novelist Marilyn Robinson, and he was actually interviewing her. But at one point he says, you have to understand that the way people live their lives is different from the way they act and talk politically. Your best neighbor, the guy who pulls over to the side of the road and jacks up your car so you can replace a tire, maybe someone who's ideologically opposed to you. I think I've been reading a lot of Walt Whitman. I think Americans do want to think that. We do like to think that about ourselves. That's why they say it's always the optimist, who can prevail, or often it is. And to see someone like that come out of either party at this moment seems like a stretch. So you do wonder about the calculation someone like Vance might be making.
And it's interesting you say, because there just seems to be a complete dearth of optimism on the right for some reason. The Republican Party controls Congress. It controls the presidency. Donald Trump made his great political comeback. The Democrats were in full retreat. Nobody wanted to be a Democrat. The registration numbers were dropping like a rock. People who just had normal lib politics, people who had lefty politics, nobody really wanted to be associated with this Democratic Party, which of course has its own problems. There's a lot of infighting over there, over Chuck Schumer, over their strategy and things like that. But there is a sense of optimism on the left that I think was personified by Zohran Mamdani, saying, yes, we can do this. Yes, we can. Yes, we can build it. Yes, government can solve your problems. And on the right now, it's just a much darker picture. It's almost a surrender. It's saying this experiment has failed. we need to try something totally different. And that totally different thing is essentially going back to the Dark Ages, back to medieval times, Mencius mold bug and all of that stuff. The idea that America needs a monarch, some sort of strong man. And these were some of the original, Buckley, when he first was trying to organize the right, there were monarchists running around. They were some of the first people he needed to get rid of. And now it's that sort of ethos. It's just a very dark vision that the Republican Party seems to be presenting to the country. And I just don't see exactly how that becomes an electoral winner, particularly after you've controlled the country for 4 years, as J.D. Vance will have to do in 2028.
Well, and you remind me when you mentioned Mencius Moldberg, before we were hearing about Groypers, we were hearing about the Bronze Age pervert and how all the young Republicans were excited by him.
And now he seems like a respectable elder.
Oh, that's right.
I mean, like, talk about like strange new respect. It's like Bronze Age pervert is some sort of like, I never read his book or anything like that. I was a little bit old to like get into that stuff. But it was like, he's like the center, it seems like. But it's just like, the right is just this mystery box at this point. We don't really know what's going on inside it. We don't know who is winning this fight, winning this argument, but we do know it's dark. Everybody here seems to have a really dark vision of this country. And that's not really what the right, in my mind, is supposed to do. The right in particular is supposed to have a very positive vision of this country. It's supposed to be the more patriotic party, the GOP. It's supposed to win on those issues and frame the Democrats as people who are not so attached to the flag, not so attached to the Constitution. And the right seems to be surrendering a lot of ground to win over, I don't know what Nick Fuentes' nightly audience is, but, we're not talking about 15 million people. He's not getting Johnny Carson numbers there.
Right. Well, there are no Johnny Carson numbers to be had as part of it.
Right. That's the thing. It's so diffuse. Nobody can command that sort of loyalty at this point.
Another thing I'd mention is I'd ask is, because that's a very cogent description, bleak but cogent description of where the right is.
Bleak but cogent. That's kind of my brand.
When do you think it began? If you could, if you could locate a point of origin, what would it be for you? When did it change?
That's a really interesting question. And I mean, the obvious point would seem to be the golden escalator. But I mean, I think Bannon always goes back to the 2008 crash and the general failures of the George W. Bush presidency, because that was very problematic for the right, because you had George W. Bush saying, I am the heir of Reagan's mantle. And that is the Republican Party that I am presenting to you. That is the Republican Party that I lead. And then you had these calamitous mistakes during the administration, the Iraq War. Then you have the 2008 crash. I'm not going to get into how much the administration is responsible for that, or the regulatory authorities or anything like that. But, I have been to the George W. Bush Museum in Fort Worth, I believe it is. And I walked through it, and you're just exhausted by the end of it, because you remember how exhausting the George W. Bush presidency was. So I think a lot of it stems from those failures. And then, I see these reports that in addition to Nick Fuentes, everybody on the young right now loves Pat Buchanan again. And of course, Buckley had a strange relationship with Pat Buchanan. Buckley wrote this famous tract in the early 90s called In Search of Antisemitism, in which he excommunicated at least one of his writers, and Joe Sobran, who would go on to start speaking at Holocaust denial conferences and things like that, and said that Pat Buchanan, I believe, he's done some anti-Semitic things, though not personally an anti-Semite. And then they turned around less than a year later and endorsed his campaign for president, his primary challenge against George H.W. Bush. And that was described as a strategic move. Buckley was clearly more of the Bush ilk than the Buchanan ilk. But what do you make of this resurgence of Pat Buchanan, this return of this figure?
I've written about Pat Buchanan. I interviewed him for the book, and I wrote a profile of him for Esquire magazine. I think it was 2017, 2018.
He's a very good writer.
He's a good writer. He's a wonderful talker.
Yeah.
And he's an extremely pleasant companion. He's a fun guy to talk to. And I believe when I was writing that story, we can don't quote me, but I'm quite sure that I saw a statement of David Brooks, who's another protege of Buckley, in which he said Pat Buchanan is now the most influential intellectual in America because he had presaged Trumpism. Now, there's also the case that Mike Lind makes, and John Gans may be on that too, that Ross Perot is also a kind of a pre-Trump figure. When I'll tell you something, when I was in Steve Bannon's office just Friday to do the interview about my Buckley book, and I'd never met him. I'd interviewed him once or twice for a story I'd written, and he came in and he said, "Well, this is an honor. You are the intellectual godfather of the new populism." And so I looked around and went, "Who's he talking about?" He said, "No, I mean you." And he said, "You know that, don't you?" And I said, No, I don't." And he said, "Well, that book you wrote, The Death of Conservatism," he said, "back in 2008, the little book I wrote, you may or may not know, that in a very brief way traced the trajectory of the right from the Buckley era up through McCain's defeat in 2008. And it worked through some of the themes that are done much more broadly in the big biography. And while I was sitting there flabbergasted, Steve Bannon said, "Well, Andrew Breitbart and I knew that Conservatism Inc., and that term didn't exist when I wrote that book, said Conservatism Inc. was finished. And we knew that the next wave would be populist, but you gave us the intellectual frame for looking at it." So I went back and looked at it because I don't remember, it's 15 years ago. And I see that a lot of it is about the battle, and it's discussed again more narratively in this big book, between what at one moment was called the blue collar right versus the blue blood right. And the originator of that term was Paul Weyrich, who started the Heritage Foundation back in the 70s, when Buckley and company seemed too effete, too sophisticated, too intellectual in their concerns. And the newer upsurge was going to come from the George Wallace voters and maybe the Reagan voters. And that was the idea, that they'd create a coalition. Well, Bannon looks at that and he sees a template. So he says, now there's also a bit of flattery of Barney. And
he's a showman, yes.
He's a showman too. But also he had that way of kind of looking at things with a bigger view than you might imagine. That's why one reason he's so great with Mondami, for instance. He can see just the sheer talent that so he can see him as an actor, partly because Bannon is a filmmaker, So I think in that sense, we're in this place again where familiar emotions, familiar ambitions keep bubbling up to the surface, and now there's greater surface area for them to be expressed. So it's a lot harder to contain them, and it will be up. Some political figure is going to have to be able to find a rhetoric again that harnesses enough of that it can be made presentable to a more centrist electorate. Can that be done? I really don't know. You seem pretty skeptical. You don't seem to think it can happen.
Well, you always have to, weigh in. We talk about, okay, so let's divide the country vulgarly. You have 33% are essentially MAGA, 33% hardcore Democrats, and then the rest, 33%, sort of up to grabs. But when we think of those independent voters, those median voters, of course, it's not that they're all moderates. That's a mistake that we sometimes make. A lot of them just have a bunch of kind of contradictory radical opinions. Therefore, you have voters who are going for Mamdani and Trump. You have people in AOC's district who are voting for Trump and AOC on the same day. Figuring out those voters and where they are. I mean, first, I think the right needs to figure out its own people and its own numbers and who the army is that they're going to war with. And they need to figure that out quickly, because otherwise you're just going to have a situation where Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson essentially become the leaders of the movement. And yes, they are charismatic. Yes, they have followings. But that's the kind of thing, Tucker runs for president. There's going to be a lot of intellectual admirers. Some young John Didion is going to say, it's like, well, he sure is authentic. He speaks from the heart. There's a lot of interesting things going on. But like Barry Goldwater, that's a 49 state defeat in my mind. Unless, of course, the Democrats screw it up, because the Democrats, as we know, always have the ability to screw it up.
They always have the ability to screw it up. And if we are looking at a horseshoe moment, we may actually see left and right colliding in a way we haven't seen before if the Senate drops out. I gave a talk to Yale conservatives in September. They invited me. They're a small group, not that Buckley organization.
Not the party of the right, but like the young Republicans.
Yes, that's right. And they invited me to speak to them. And, great kids. And at one point, they were saying, well, who do you think the next leader might be, the next Buckley might be? I said, I really don't know. Who do you think? And they said, Tucker Carlson. It was the first name that came up.
I mean, Tucker is an extraordinarily impressive individual in many ways. He's very funny. He's articulate. He knows how to make an argument. He's a great debater, which is why so many of us were disappointed with the Nick Fuentes interview. I mean, he just eviscerated Ted Cruz. He left Ted Cruz dead on the ground. And Ted Cruz is supposed to be this great debater.
Supposed to be a great debater.
Yeah, but when Tucker throws softballs with, that Martyr Maid guy, Daryl Cooper, who he tried to promote as the best historian in America.
Oh, right.
Who just has the kooky ideas about World War II. Well, we're going to see how it shakes out. I want to wind this down, but Sam, you have a genius of you are a man of the left. Correct me if you think that's wrong, but I would consider you a man of the left. But you have so many friends on the right, and to such an extent that when Bill Buckley, as he became, got into old age and he was thinking about his legacy and who's going to write his biography, he goes to you, someone who has a lot of political differences with Buckley, to write that biography. And as we approach this moment and we deal with this moment of such profound division, I just want to talk to you about, you're a man with deep convictions that tend towards left, and you have so many friends and admirers on the right. And how does that happen? And what advice would you give to people who are just trying to keep an open mind and keep their friendships going and keep their relationships going with people who they disagree with at this exceptionally fraught moment?
What a wonderful question. And not because you said nice things about me, which I always welcome, but because
that was authentic, by the way. That was authenticity right there.
Yeah, well, it's very kind of you to say that, and it's funny. I'll give you two different versions of the same question. Again, when I was on Bannon's show, and I was surprised that he invited me on, and then he said, I have to ask you, how does a secular Jewish liberal Democrat who worked for the New York Times and lives in Connecticut become the historian of the American right?
Yeah.
Right. Why does that happen? And then I was speaking at a synagogue the other day, and he's right. Steve Bannon is right. I am not observant, but I gave a book talk the way we often will at a synagogue near us in Connecticut. And the first question was, what's a nice Jewish boy like you doing writing a biography of William F. Buckley Jr.? And I would say, my heroes are the great storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
The biographers are like Robert Caro, whom I know and admire and have learned a great deal from. The great novelists that we read. I'm reading Don DeLillo now, and the 19th. DeLillo's fun. I'm reading Libra, which is great.
Libra is wonderful. Mao Tzu also.
Yes,
very underrated.
I'm going on to Mao Tzu next.
Mao Tzu is prophetic. Yeah,
that's others have told me that Libra is great, and Buckley liked it, and that's one key. It is, what people call empathy, and now J.D. Vance doesn't like that term, so we'll call it something else. It's trying to imagine yourself in somebody else's skin. I think if you become a storyteller and a listener to other people, then you become more sympathetic. One surprise I discovered early on with Bill Buckley and Richard Brookhiser, one of his proteges, The one guy at National Review who liked my book said to him that this was the surprise for him too. This was the news, is what a great listener Buckley was. You know, we think of Buckley with his clever riposte, amazingly quick mind. I was in his presence. You almost can't imagine how quickly his mind worked. But he seldom interrupted. He listened closely to what you had to say. He might turn it against you. In the book, I call it predatory attentiveness. He's listening so closely so he can get at you. On the other hand, he's listening. And I do think we all have it in us to do that. And once you start listening to somebody closely, you start imagining yourself being a little closer to that person. I'll give you an example, and she won't like my saying this probably, but my wife could not believe it when she saw Marjorie Taylor Greene with those victims. I said to her, she's turned around on this thing. And she said, well, she must have ideological reasons. I said, no, she is there with the victims. And then my wife said, that's impressive. And it was making that step. And if we can do more of that, I really think we can do that. Then the differences don't go away, but they become less jagged, you know, than they seem to be now. Look, I know you too have a lot of friends on the left. You're very close to someone I think is maybe the most brilliant writer on the left right now, or someone you're extremely close to. Yeah, because you respect, you listen, you respect what they have to say, the way they say it, also how they treat you. I think you look for people treat you well. I had one conversation with Donald Trump my entire life. Long before he ran for president, I was the editor of the New York Times Book Review. And he had a book, we had a rule then that how-to books could not get on the bestseller because you had to look for a way to keep books off. If you open up the bestseller list to every book, then the Bible is number one every week from here to eternity. So we didn't allow how-to books. And Trump called me up. This was in 2011, I think it was, 2010. And I had not met him before. I've never met him since. But he was already very famous, obviously. He was so ingratiating. I had no idea. And I think this happens to a lot of people, now, which means you can be seduced by that.
Yeah, totally.
But the question would be, well, would Trump listen? That's the thing I want to know. Would he really listen to you and remember what you said? And I think, you know, Hannah Arendt, the great political philosopher, said the great politicians listen. That's really what it means to be a person in a democratic society. And I think if we all did a little more of that, the way you are here, you're very patiently listening to me. And even as I learned from you, and that's where it starts.
Listen, be friends with people. Do not end friendships over political disagreements. I think we can agree that that's the advice we want to give today.
Absolutely.
Sam Tanenhaus, thank you so much for being here on the Free Press live stream. We thank you so much. Hope to talk to you soon.
What a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, Will.
Same here, Sam. Thank you so much.
Thank you.